We've kind of given overviews so far about this particular course of study on how to put the whole message of the Bible together and see how it unfolds and how we're supposed to understand our responsibilities toward God. And last time we were together, I basically laid out the 6 covenants that kind of comprised the backbone and the outline of all of the Bible. And it was the Adamic covenant, I called it. That's the one with Adam. The Noahic, and then Abrahamic, Mosaic, Davidic, and then the new covenant. And we're going to start with the Abrahamic for our purposes in this class. And we're just doing that for the sole reason that we're kind of narrowing things down to a specific discussion about the nation of Israel, how it applies to 2024. We're in 2024 now, right? 2024, and how we should understand the modern nation of Israel, especially as regards what the Bible has to say about it. So that's why we're going to start with Abraham, and then we're going to look at the Mosaic covenant, the Davidic covenant, the new covenant. And I think those of you who have been in this class and on Sunday afternoons, you kind of have a good running understanding of why we're going about it this way. So today, it's just the Abrahamic covenant. We're going to see what are we supposed to really take away from it as Christians, as those living today and in the new covenant age. So the first thing about the Abrahamic covenant, let's read the places where we can learn some things about it. This is the Old Testament context. So we go back to the book of Genesis, and we're going to start in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. This is where it all begins. And the Lord had said to Abram, "Get out of your country and from your family and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And so Abraham did depart as the Lord had spoken to him. And so he did obey God's command to get out of his country. The Ur of the Chaldees is where he lived in modern Babylon, modern Iraq, but was known as Babylon in later years. So he obeyed. And this is the beginning of this promised covenant with Abraham. Now, the covenant hadn't been entered into yet, but it was a promise made, and God's a promise keeper. And so there will be a covenant. But as we see the story unfold, he leaves and he comes to this land. And for example, verse 7, "Then the Lord appeared to Abraham." So this is in this land that he came to. "And he said, 'To your descendants I will give this land.' And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him." So there is a promise, I'm going to give you this land. We know that land as the land of Canaan in the Old Testament. Today it would be Palestine, modern day Palestine. Now let's look at chapter 13 because there's... Yes. I'm sorry?
What people's covered descendants?
Abraham's offspring. That's all we know about it so far. So Abraham didn't have any offspring yet. No children whatsoever. And so all we know at this point is that he will have children. God's made a promise. And so that's all we know so far. Now, and I'm glad you asked that, but that's what we'll kind of trace through here. Very good. So in the next chapter, it talks about him and Lot, and they had a disagreement and such. But by the time they separate, look at verse, 14 and 15. "The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, 'Lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, westward, for all the land which you see, I give to you and your descendants,'" or your seed, "forever." That's an important word. Forever. Verse 16, "I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth," and so forth. There's again the promise of the descendants. Now, chapter 15 is when you actually get the covenant entered into. The covenant is created in chapter 15. And for example, what verses do I have? Because I kind of selected them for brevity's sake. Verse 5, God brought Abraham outside, and he said, "Look now toward heaven and count the stars if you're able to number them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." So there's going to be a lot of descendants from Abraham. And he believed in the Lord, and the Lord accounted it to him for righteousness. That's an important verse in the New Testament, isn't it? That they quote, that is quoted 3 times in the New Testament. Verse 7 says, "Then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur to the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit." And then follows the covenant ritual and things that God performed for Abraham. We don't have time to get into that. Let's look at verse 18. It says, "On that same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram." So it's important to understand, technically speaking, the covenant was not created until chapter 15. The promise of it was made in chapter 12, and so that's usually where we begin. But this is it. And then he said, here's the covenant, or on the day that he made the covenant, this is what he said, verse 18, "To your descendants I have given this land." And then he demarcates the borders. And that's like the river Euphrates, that's all the way up north, to the river of Egypt, all the way down south, to the, all of the land that's there in the Middle East. Okay, and now in chapter 17, you have, verses 8 through 11. So God says, now this is going to be a few years later in the story, but nonetheless, it says, God said, "I give you and your descendants after you the land in which you're a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." So that's important. God said to Abram, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, throughout their generations. This is it. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male child among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you." So the promise of the covenant is chapter 12, the actual covenant is chapter 15, and the sign of the covenant is chapter 17. Fair enough? Okay. So that's basically under that point on your notes. I say there's the covenant made with Abraham on the same day the Lord made the covenant. And this covenant is now going to be the backdrop of the rest of the Old Testament. I guess I could probably put the rest of the Bible, as we'll see by the time class is over. But the rest of the Old Testament has this in the backdrop, even though there are some other covenants to follow. Now, central to this Abrahamic covenant is, and I've delineated the land promise, the seed promise, and circumcision. Those are the 3 that we've seen. Okay? And so now we're going to break down our study in those 3 points. But first, let's look at the New Testament interpretation. Now, this is what we talked about Sunday. Do you remember? We talked about Jesus showing how to interpret the Old Testament. He showed his disciples that for 40 days. So let's see one example of that. Seth?
So you said in 12 is the promise of the covenant?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the actual covenant, and then the sign?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what you meant.
Yeah. Chapter 12, the covenant wasn't there yet, but it was promised.
Yeah, okay. I didn't know what words you used.
Yeah, that's right. You betcha. So, how does the New Testament interpret it? Now, I've got to qualify this a little bit. There's different places you can go to get different specifics and different nuances of things, okay? And I'm just going to go to one because it's a pretty important one, I think. And it'll be in Hebrews. So turn to Hebrews, and this will also give us occasion to look at a couple of places where Paul addresses it too. But Hebrews chapter 11. So here again, this is, I just want to keep our vision clear here. How are we supposed to understand the Abrahamic covenant? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to me? We live so far removed from it. Well, let's see what the New Testament says about it, and then we can show this New Testament interpretation or Christian interpretation as we learn from the New Testament. So, 11 verses 8 and following mentions, Hebrews 11 verses 8 and following, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going." Well, we just read that, didn't we? Verse 9, "By faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents, along with Abraham and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. We didn't talk about that, but if you read further on in Genesis, you would see that Isaac received the same promise and Jacob received the same promise. But nonetheless, verse 10, it says, because he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Now, in these first verses of chapter 11, you have different men of the Old Testament who are praised for their faith, right? So you have Abel and Enoch, and then Noah is the first 7 verses. Here it moves to Abraham, that we just read, verse 8. It mentions Isaac and Jacob, and then Sarah is mentioned in verse 11, right? And verse 13 is a little bit of a parenthesis kind of, where the writer says, all these died in faith. I think he means Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Sarah, but just because of what follows. But he's talking about not just Abraham, but at least Isaac, Jacob, and Sarah. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them from afar, they embraced them, and they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to go back. But they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. And so God is not ashamed to be called their God, because why? He has prepared a city for them. Anybody have any thoughts right now on some of the things we just read? I mean, there is one specific answer I'm looking for, but you may not get it. Anybody care to? What strikes you?
Obedience.
Okay, obedience. By faith he obeyed. Anything else?
Well, the city that he's looking for wasn't on the earth.
That's where I'm headed with it. Say.
That's what I was going to say.
Like what? Now we're talking about a city. You read all through the book of Genesis and Abraham's promises and all that. There's nothing about a city. But the New Testament is making this interpretation, is making this expansion of what was going on in these promises. Are you with me? This is what I mean by Jesus teaching his disciples how to read the Old Testament with Christian eyes, so to speak. And this is what we learn. And so on the notes you can see I have at number 1 under B, I say Abraham waited for the city of God. And then we read 13 through 16, which is number 2 there, where I said Abraham and all these Old Testament saints did not receive the ultimate promise. Now, the reason I put ultimate, it doesn't say ultimate in the text, I put it in my own brackets there. Meaning, if you read through Joshua, it says they did receive the land. It says they did receive the promises. Not one thing that the Lord promised failed to come to pass. Joshua 24, Joshua 23, 44 through 45 and stuff. So there's a sense in which they did receive the promises because Joshua himself says they did. And then 1 Kings 4:21 says the same thing. So, but this text says they did not receive. And I'm saying here the ultimate promises.
So there's 2 different things.
Yeah, there's a couple of things going on here. This is what I'm saying. When we talk about dispensationalism, they're focused only on that first thing. They're not thinking about the way the New Testament is interpreting the fulfillment. And they believe if God says, I'm going to give you and your descendants this land forever, well, then the Jews belong in the land. And God's going to give it to them forever. And when Jesus comes back, he's going to reign there. And they're going to be the greatest nation on earth. And they're going to receive the land forever. Does that make sense? They're going to live eternally there. But that kind of thing. That's a dispensational understanding. That's why we're even bringing these points out. So, and hang with me. So they did not receive the ultimate promises, but by faith they saw them from afar, and they sought, it says they sought a homeland. And I think behind that, an ultimate homeland, a better one, as the Hebrews writer said here. And God has indeed prepared a city for them. That would be a future city. And I even look down at the last two verses of this chapter, Hebrews 11:39. It says, all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, what? Did not receive the promise. Because God provided something better for us. Who's he talking to? Us. Christians. So that they would not be made perfect apart from us. In other words, we're all going to receive something better than what was originally conceived as being the whole promise. If you can start putting that idea in your mind, you're going to really benefit, I think, from all of these covenant studies that we're going to have. There's something better, there's something more expansive about all of these promises in the Old Testament that is even better than what we thought.
I'm confused.
Okay. I'm good at that.
Okay, I'll be patient. Just-
Oh, I thought you was going to tell me, what are you confused about?
Well, I'm confused about did not receive the promise.
Yes. Well, because, first of all, the Hebrews writer is saying they didn't receive the promise, but he's talking about the city.
Still talking.
Yeah, I mean, because he says that they didn't receive the promise because God has prepared a city for them, and they would not be made perfect without us. Okay? So we haven't answered all of that. We're just saying, wow, there's something more to what we read just in the Old Testament text itself. Because the New Testament is telling us that. Yes, Donnie.
So, is it the entire promises in Genesis 12 they talk to, or is it just the reward of being of the families of the earth? You know, I'm trying to put this word.
Okay.
Is it just the seed, the promise of being a child of Abraham?
Right. That's what the rest of this class is going to... Yeah, so let's go through the rest of the notes, and I bet we're going to answer what you've got in your mind here. So you can see now that I have it divided into the 3 points I made earlier about those components of the Abrahamic covenant: the land promise, the seed promise, and circumcision. Well, the New Testament picks up all of that. Okay? So let's talk about the land promise, just because that's kind of been the way we framed this class in dealing with modern Israel over there today in the land. And you can see that number 3, I say a land promise or city promise, because you don't read about a city promise in the Old Testament. But the New Testament is applying it that way in some sense. So let's talk about that. I say, where does the Old Testament speak of Abraham seeing or looking for a city? Well, it doesn't. This is the New Testament interpretation. It's reading the Christocentric interpretation back into the Old Testament covenants, which I think they learned from Jesus himself. This is what Jesus taught them to do. What's Hebrews 12:24 say? 12:22 rather. You have come, so if you knew the context, which I'm going to assume most of you already do, he's talking here about the difference in the Old Testament Mount Sinai and the New Testament, Mount what? Zion. Well, what's that? That's the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But he's talking to Christians. And he's saying, think about it, Christians. Now that you're in Christ and you are part of his body, you're part of the new covenant, you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, to what? The heavenly Jerusalem. That's the city he's been talking about. The heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and the church of the firstborn ones who are registered in heaven. You've come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men now made perfect. I wonder if he was talking about those Hebrews 11 saints. The just men now made perfect. So are you seeing how all this comes together? The fulfillment of this Abrahamic land promise that now seems to be a city promise is fulfilled where? In the heavenly Jerusalem. That's the city. Or another way to refer to it, the church of the firstborn ones. The body of Christ. Mount Zion. See, Zion is a spiritual name for the Mount Moriah, which was the mountain on which the temple was built in Jerusalem. Remember Abraham sacrificing Isaac on the Mount Moriah? Well, that was to become Mount Zion. That's the poetic name of the Temple Mountain, where God dwells in the heavenly realms on Zion. Are you with me? So, the city of God is heavenly Jerusalem / Mount Zion. I could put / Church of the Firstborn / whatever else, however else the General Assembly. Talking about the council of God that we've talked about before in Old Testament, that divine council. On and on. So, modern political thought that is based on dispensationalism in our Western culture and in American evangelicalism thinks of modern Israel / Palestine. They believe the promises are yet to be fulfilled in the Middle East. That's what dispensationalism is all about. And Israel is still the people of God over there in the Middle East. That's the whole reason that the UN planted them there in 1948. Because they had these assumptions, being informed by the religious element, that the Jews are God's people. And God gave them this land over there. They need to go back to that land. Interestingly, I have there, the last peace treaty to be signed was during the Trump administration in 2020. And it was a huge step toward peace, politically speaking, but you know what those were called that they signed? The Abraham Accords. Well, why would they call them that? It was a way to say, listen, Palestinians and Jews, you all trace back to one man. So let's get along. Let's learn how to have peace. Now, certainly that's true. The people are genetically related to Abraham, but so are their faith systems in the sense. Because the Arabs descended from Ishmael, right? Sorry, from Ishmael. And so, religious sentiment, I think, focuses on the biblical significance of their lineage back to Abraham. And I have an example of that in the next point. Since the late 1800s, there has been both a religious as well as a political agenda, and we know of it as Zionism. Have you ever heard of the Zionist movement? There's Christian Zionism. That would be the dispensational position that says we need to support Israel and get the Temple Mount back, Mount Zion, that belongs to them. They need to build a temple there so that they can fulfill the covenants of the Old Testament. And they seek to reclaim the Temple Mount for modern Israel. Without getting into all the historical details, there's a non-religious aspect of Zionism, but it still is based upon the history of the Jews, believing that God gave the Jews that land and that Temple Mountain. Yes?
Isn't that all starting with when Joshua's instruction was to kill everyone in the land, and he didn't. So that kind of like ruined the concept that all of that land was going to be for the Jews because he didn't destroy all of the other people that lived there.
Right.
So they had an opportunity to raise up and fight back and take the land over.
I would say that's definitely an element of it, because Mary's bringing up that in Joshua's day they failed to exterminate all of the Canaanites that God told them to exterminate. The book of Judges is about the repercussions of that. They had all these other nations that they were always warring with. And so God had to raise up judges and such. And so that was one example of their failure to fulfill God's will. But through the history, it was idolatry. It was all kinds of sin. The main sin was worshiping other gods. And then God said, he promised as far back as Deuteronomy, when you do that, I'm going to vomit you out of the land just like I vomited the inhabitants of Canaan out of the land. And so there was always conditions attached to the land. And so, but that would be one. It's just an example that they didn't fulfill all of God's will, and their idolatry is what led to the final straw. So yes, that's true. But again, with dispensationalism, they're reading those verses that I emphasized earlier that said, I give you and your descendants this land forever. I will give you and your descendants this land forever. And they say, well, see, if you're going to believe the Bible, then you got to believe that God's going to give them the land forever. It's never not going to be theirs. What do you think that means? What does forever mean then?
Yeah, forever has a different meaning.
Yeah, it means in perpetuity as long as you keep the covenant. When you renege on the covenant, well, all bets are off. That's just like you marry somebody and enter into a covenant, and God says if they renege on the faithfulness of the covenant, you can put them away. It's a terrible situation. It should never happen, and it's sin. The violating the covenant is sinful, but that's terms of the covenant. And so we would make the same point to the dispensationalists. The terms of the covenant were here's the law. You need to follow the law and obey the law, and I'll make you prosper in the land. If you violate it, the land's going to vomit you out just like it vomits the inhabitants out. There's no difference. There's no distinction. And so Israel was never special just because, regardless of what they did, there was conditions put upon them. And that's one of the points we would make today. Israel, modern Israel as a nation, is just as anti-Christian as any other nation. They don't have any concern for Christ. In fact, they antagonistic to Christianity in so many ways. So there's no reason to think that they are in any way more pleasing to God than anybody else. So now, where am I? Because we're about out of time. So there's no way to finish all this. But I just wanted to spend a little time on this land promise because this was one of the points we've been making. So you see now the New Testament is interpreting the land promise in a Christian way and saying, you realize that God actually expanded the promises to Abraham. This will give us rise to look at some of Paul's statements. So letter C there in the middle of the page says, the New Testament speaks of the church. And I say here, and or, depending on your particular interpretation of some of these things we'll talk about, our final reward as the fulfillment. So what we've seen in Hebrews 12:22 and following seems to point just limited to the church so far, right? You've come to Mount Zion and to the church or the firstborn. Well, that's the city that he talks about Abraham seeing. But there are other elements, especially in Paul's writings about the land promise, that seems to also point to our final reward as the final fulfillment, where we will receive the land forever. Does that make sense? So the land is going to be received forever in a literal sense by the true Israel of God, which is the church. Are you with me? So let's look at some of those. So I have here that the final fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant may include, and I say may here because there are different interpretations in the brotherhood on this, so I'm just putting them out there for your consideration. Number one, that the church encompasses all nations, and so that would be the whole world and not Israel only. So that would be an example of, you've heard he's got the whole world in his hands or something like that. This is my Father's world. We sing that kind of thing. And so when we look at the verses like that say, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And then we say, wait, what does that mean? Do Christians own the earth? And sometimes we just say, well, we believe that since God is our Father and God owns the earth, and therefore we are his heirs and so forth, and we just kind of leave it at that. Now, there are other ways of understanding that in the sense of number two there. The land promise is expanded to include the whole earth. That is to say, the new heavens and the new earth. And this is a New Testament doctrine. And again, this is going to depend on how you interpret what the New Testament means by all of that. But I'm just saying, before you decide what interpretation you agree on, you got to at least agree that the New Testament teaches that phrase. And so whatever it might mean, could it not be the fulfillment of this land promise? Now, how so? How can we be more specific? Look at Romans 4:13. We'll have time to go there before class is over. In Romans 4, here's Paul talking about Abraham, the promises. In Romans 4:13, what does it say?
Well, the promise to Abraham or to his descendants that he would be heir of the world was not through the law, but through the righteousness of faith.
He's promised that he would be heir of what?
The world.
Well, that's not in the Old Testament. It's just the land of Canaan. But Paul says there was a promise that he would be heir of the world. So you see what I'm saying? That's Paul's interpretation of the Old Testament, an apostle's interpretation, a Christian interpretation of the Old Testament. And so I just have some verses there, like I mentioned, Matthew 5:5 about the blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. The promise to Abraham was he'd be heir of the world. And then the 2 Peter 3 and the Revelation 21, 1 through 3, interestingly, combines the new heavens and the new earth with the heavenly Jerusalem. That's Revelation 21, 1 through 3, when it says, there was a new heavens and new earth because the first heaven and first earth had passed away, no more sea. And I saw the holy city, heavenly Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God, and it came to the new earth. Yes. Carter?
I was just going to say that the key thing I think from the Romans passage was Abraham and his offspring.
Yeah.
Because you can look at, I'm sure you'll get into the whole who are Abraham's offspring.
I won't have time.
I know, well, I'm not
Yeah.
saying,
But yeah.
It's, you have to look at where else Paul interprets who exactly are Abraham's
And that's the next point that we just can't get to, but it's the seed promise. Carter is bringing up that Romans 14:3 that says the promise to Abraham and to his seed that he would be heir of the world. Well, who's Abraham's seed? And if you read Galatians 3 in particular, it says that the seed, singular, is Christ. And at the very end of that passage, it says, and if you are Christ's, you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So you are an heir of the world if you put Paul's words together in those two passages. Yes, Seth.
Revelation 14:1 alludes to Zion being,
The Lamb standing on Zion.
the future, in heaven. And then I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion with him.
140.
144,000 having his name, the name of his father written on their foreheads, etc. And so, in my head, that points to the city of Zion being future, post-judgment, the church eternal.
Yeah.
Everlasting.
Yeah. This is one of those times when John's perspective pans to the heavenly reality. Sometimes he's focused on earthly realities, like with the beast and the false prophet and so forth. And then he goes and sees the heavenly reality that's going on in this great fight on the earth. And it's Zion. And that's the poetic name for where God lives, right? It's God's mountain. And so you're seeing Jesus is there on the mountain of God, and he's got his followers with him, his Abraham's seed, so to speak. And so certainly so, yeah. But this mountain Zion, this heavenly city, is eternal. It's everlasting. And so that's what we're privileged to be a part of. So I know that we had 35 minutes and we got halfway through the page, but I don't really think we're going to go back to this because I want to get through the covenants in this class. So next time we'll look at the Mosaic covenant and bring out some New Testament interpretations of that. But you can read through there and you can see how I apply circumcision, because the New Testament uses the concept of the circumcision being a spiritual circumcision for the New Covenant people. In other words, it's a circumcision of the heart, and it occurs initially at baptism. Colossians 2 says you're circumcised with the circumcision of Christ, cutting off the body of the sins of the flesh, being buried with him in baptism. Does that make sense? So the circumcision is also interpreted in a Christian way and applied in a greater expanded way. It's not just for men any longer. It's for all of God's children, and we initially are circumcised in baptism, circumcision of the heart. And of course, we're supposed to live that out then with purity and holiness in our souls. So, but anyway, hopefully that gives you a little bit of stuff to chew on as far as the direction of the class and talking about how the New Testament interprets the Old Testament. And we will pick up there next time, Lord willing. Thank you so much for your attention.